Okay, I
We're
believe we're
live.
live. We are live. Welcome everybody to
Yay.
Wellness Wednesday, sponsored by A Step, Artist Striving to End Poverty. I'm Mary Mitchell Campbell, and I work with A Step and founded A Step. And this is Dr. Keith Bell. We've been doing this program, Wellness Wednesday, on Wednesdays, bringing a focus on wellness to our community.
Yeah, Wellness Wednesday. I am Dr. Keith Bell. I'm a doctor of acupuncture and Chinese medicine coming to you from Richmond, Virginia. And Wellness Wednesday is where Mary Mitchell and I bring together practitioners of the healing arts with practitioners of the creative arts to focus on our healing. And today we have our very first special host, Mary
We have a
Mitchell.
special guest that I invited who is somebody I've admired for a very long time, Miss Tanya Birl Torres, who is a phenomenal, wow, she's a phenomenal a lot of things. She's a phenomenal singer and dancer and performer, but also a phenomenal yoga practitioner and a very powerful voice in our community. And I'm so excited that she is here with us today.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for
And
being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
We also have a special guest today coming to you with me from Richmond, Virginia. We have Karla Helbert, who is a licensed professional counselor and yoga therapist, an award-winning author for her book, Yoga for Grief and Loss, and her latest book, The Chakras in Grief and Trauma, which is the only book out there right now on how grief and trauma impact our energetic body. So we're going to go deep with these two today on how we can transform grief and trauma and loss and sadness in this time of being isolated. Welcome, Karla.
Thank you, Keith and Mary Mitchell and Tanya. I'm super happy to be here. Glad to
um,
be with y'all.
So everyone missed the really cool conversation we had right before we started, which I was already very moved by. But I just want to, I'm going to jump right in and just say that I think, we as a community, as a global community, I live in New York and in the Broadway community have experienced such trauma in the last several months. But we in the Broadway community recently took a very intense, I would say, loss for us, which was losing one of our beloved performers, Nick Cordero, who I think many of us really were very actively and daily invested in praying for and sending good energy towards and feeling very hopeful. And that loss, I think, hit at least a lot of my friends really, really hard. So I know that we're all struggling in different ways with different kinds of losses, but I just would love for both of you guys to talk about the ways that that gets trapped in our bodies, the ways that yoga can be used as a healing mechanism, and your thoughts around how to best cope.
Hmm. That's a big question. Tanya, do you want to address it first or together?
I mean,
Or
I guess I'll just speak personally to the community's loss of Nick. And so, first of all, I'm Canadian, and Nick's also Canadian, and we grew up in the very same circles of my best friend and him grew up at the theme park singing together. I mean, it's a hit on the Broadway community, but also Canada, and artists everywhere are mourning his loss. And yeah, I mean, for me, it's always been an embodied thing, and I feel grief in the heart, like right at the center of my chest. And what I love about yoga and what I love about embodied practice, or as I say, liberatory embodied practice, is that I don't need to have words to explain how I'm feeling. And the way that it feels to me is this. So I'll give a movement more than I will. It feels like that. And I mean, I could go on about that feeling, but for me in my personal life, and just speaking from personal experience, when I've battled with grief and loss, it feels very similar in the body to great joy and love.
Hmm.
The feeling feels like a heart opening ripped apart, but I know that when my daughter went through a very traumatic health issue that risked her life, and the way that people showed up for us and the love that I experienced, and my body, without labeling it with words, felt this exact same feeling. So the more that I let go of the story from the beginning and I go to what does it physically feel like in my body, it feels like an opening, a ripping apart, a widening of something in me, particularly in my heart. So I'll just speak to that.
Well, yeah, I think it certainly can feel that way. It's interesting because it is a unique experience for everybody. For sure, it's an embodied experience. One of the things that I really love about yoga is that yoga addresses all the ways that grief and trauma both impact us on all the levels of our being. So it is an embodied experience. It's also an energetic experience. It's an experience in the mind and in our intuitive body and in our spirit body as well. So it's all of those layers of who we are that are affected. And there's an exercise I do with people a lot where we go and we think about where do we hold our grief in our body. And for me particularly, so I'll also say, I've been a therapist for a long time, but my son died of a brain tumor in 2006. And when that happened, like it changes who you are. It changes everything. And so Keith, when we were talking earlier this week about identity and loss of identity, like that is a huge part of what traumatic grief, especially because there's grief and then there's traumatic grief. And it shifts who you think you are in the world. Like it changes so much. But like my grief, I hold it actually like here. It's like in my belly and at my solar plexus, and it's interesting. It feels, it is like an opening. It's like a tunneling, it's like a cave. And the more I go into that space, like the deeper it can go and it can get. And I do an exercise with people of finding where they hold a lot of people keep it in their throat and in their shoulders and this, like the throat chakra space, right? And it's so different. And some people have multiple spaces. And one of the things that helped me, because a lot of my friends are therapists too, would say, oh, hey, do you think you need to see a therapist? Should you go to a therapist? And I'm a therapist. I know how this stuff works. And I was afraid to go. I just thought, if anybody tells me to get over this or move past it or tries to like codify it and put it in stages, I will be furious, because I was already furious. And I was just afraid. Felt very protective of that grief, right? But what did help me was support groups for one thing, but all sorts of creative things. I was doing writing so much, painting, movement, and that's a thing we do too. So when I figure out, like with a person, where are you holding this in your body? We do writing about it, we'll do art pieces about it, and then we engage with the images and we engage with that feeling. And I was like, I'm just like, act it out, right? Move it through, like, because our emotions are meant to move. And so often we feel paralyzed by grief and trauma, and trauma literally can be paralyzing. So, because that touches on the nervous system and the fight, flight, freeze mode. And some people just freeze up, but we need to work on allowing the emotions to move. Like the word emotion comes from a Latin verb, emovere, which means to move. And like classically and poetically, our emotions have always been connected with the water element. And that's why, because they're meant to flow. It doesn't mean that, they'll flow and move and something new can come in. It doesn't mean it won't also be more sadness or more grief, but the more we can keep that movement and that flow, then the more space we can have to breathe and to move within it. And creative expression. That's why it's so cool that we're talking to an artist, the community of artists, because y'all already know that, right? You know already how to move feeling. And it's just when you then have to look at your own and learn how do you express that? How do you find the creative modality that best helps you to move your feeling? That's really what I work on with a lot of the people that I work with, either in retreats and workshops or one-on-one. But it's powerful. And I love that you were doing this movement, Tanya, with your grief, because it's so personal. It's just unique to every person.
So I think you two both made an excellent point, and this is one of the reasons that we wanted to have you here, is that emotions are physical. A lot of people combine mental and emotional as one, and they think that emotions and thoughts are the same things, but thoughts and emotions are two different things, and emotions are actually stored in the body. And this is why yoga and movement is so powerful in transforming these difficult emotions to deal with. So Mary Mitchell was talking earlier about Nick, and that Nick had become a symbol for the artistic community, and all the artists were reaching out, and they were holding hope, and they were singing to him and sending him these beautiful creations. And when he passed, I think it broke a lot of people. What can these artists do to transform? Because I think, like what you were saying, Mary Mitchell, this is when people had hope, and now they're losing it. They're losing hope. How can they connect using movement, using breath, using yogic principles? It's a big question.
Well, wait, I wanted to see if Tanya wanted to address it initially. I mean, I know what I would say.
Yeah. No, go
Karla,
ahead.
go.
Well, one, you cannot force transformation, right? Like, people like to talk about transforming and transcending, and there's no way to push that. Like, what I try to convey to people in pain and grief is the first, allowing what is to be. And I always say, with as much compassion as possible and as little judgment as possible for what is happening right now. And that's the first place, right? And then working with those feelings and emotions. And I think when we are open to it, when we approach, and this is hard because people don't want to be feeling these things. Like, that's what sucks about it, is you don't want to be feeling it in the first place. And so here you have somebody asking you to willingly go into those feelings. And it's really hard because nobody wants to. So this is why you have so much experiential avoidance and attempts to just like numb out your feelings, which I totally understand. Like, I mean, don't even judge that. I get it. But it's little tiny baby steps to becoming aware. And and everything I'm saying, like, there are yogic principles and philosophies that uphold these things, right? There's a concept called svadhyaya in yoga, which the classical definition of it is study of spiritual texts, but it's also meant to be self-inquiry and self-awareness. And honestly, you can't study any spiritual text and get anything out of it if you don't have self-awareness and self-inquiry. So applying that in your pain and then surrendering to that process. And that's hard because we don't want to be surrendering to pain. We want to be getting rid of it, but you can't force it, that's the thing. And it's really hard in that way because I know people don't want to be feeling it. And when I ask them to feel it, it's scary. But that's the first step, is to allowing that vulnerability and allowing the fear even. And what you start to notice, which is true of all emotion, that when you allow it to be what it is, it will shift and it will move. And when you can learn to be with it with as much compassion as possible and as little judgment as possible, you can learn to observe that and see it happen. Do you agree, Tanya, with what I'm saying? And add something to that.
Yes to all of it. My puppy just decided to join. Animals crazy intuitive. Like, what are you talking about?
Came to comfort you.
Came to comfort, yeah, because I'm just listening and learning, and it's so great to hear. And I also want to make sure that, like, I came to yoga as a dancer, as a mover, as someone who was always found my spirituality as something that was very embodied. And I want to also speak to, to my experience being in a Black body. And that a lot of the times when we talk about these principles, yogic principles, at least I won't speak for all Black bodies, but a lot of these things we know, I know as an embodied Black person, I know what living with this constantly, whether we call it grief or not, that's the experience of being in a Black body. It's normal. And so it's retuning what when we say we, or when we say that we're actually different bodies have different experiences. And so when we even talk about these principles of swadhyaya and all the different, you know, limbs of the yogic path and all these different things, I know through being a child of a father of the Great Migration, of being a child of a mother who had to move countries a bunch of times and never felt like she belonged where she was, that going into going into my body is all that I've ever really had. It's like my body. And so I say, and I'm speaking to any Black bodies or bodies of color or bodies of culture who are listening to this conversation, that when we say we aren't just washing that everyone has the exact same experience, but that you might not know it as yogic philosophies or yogic principles or chakras, but you know, when you feel something riding up and down your spine, which is, yes, the central nervous system, and is how prana and shakti and how energy, we can have all the words, but growing up in the Black church, like lifting your hands and shouting and praising, or having to stomp your feet, or like, this is all ways that grief and trauma we've allowed to move without having to intellectualize it or to even understand it. That the more we move into what intuitively, I love Resmaa Menakem and his work, and he says that trauma in a people looks like culture. And what I know in the Black culture is that through the trauma that our bodies have experienced, we might not understand when someone talks about trauma or talks about grief or talks about generational trauma versus lived trauma versus, but what we do know is that the culture that we've inherited we have to lean on that culture, because even though trauma has produced that culture is also what will free us. And that, and listening to those places, which to me, trauma is just, not simply just, but the body, it's information, and it's like listening to those places. So I can understand. Yoga is my gateway drug of choice. I've said it's like, it's the way that I've been able to enter in, but also to know that yoga is just another another name for what your body already knows. And I know for me, being in a Black body and using acupuncture and different modalities through childbirth and giving birth to my children, I chose to, and I don't know, hopefully this isn't a tangent for those listening, but I chose to choose only people of color, women of color, to work with my body when I was giving birth, pre and postnatal. And the one message that I got from the therapist, who is a woman of color, from my midwife, from my doula, from my acupuncturist, was, you know it in your body already. It's what you know. And that, as a Black body, is something that I had not heard a lot. I had heard of different ways to do it and go here or do this or here. And never was the message, it's a remembering of who you are. You know it, it's in there. And for me, I don't even say wellness anymore. I say wholeness, because to me, it's a remembering and a returning. Something about wellness also has been co-opted and colonized. Like, I feel like wellness becomes something that you have to like achieve to be well. And so I feel like my message beyond anything to anyone that I'm speaking to about finding that place of wholeness or that place of healing, it's a remembering of what your body knows. And you're right, Karla, the only way to know is to go into that collapsing or into that void or into that space, because all of the information is there. And for the bodies of color that are watching this, just a reminder that as you hear these different principles or things, you know this. You know this in your body, you know this. And that's been my message and will continue to be my message.
I love that you're saying everything you said, because one of the things that I talk about, well, when I explain what yoga means, like the word yoga, it's one of the Sanskrit words that's always Sanskrit, right? It's yoga, and it means yoke. And it's this yoking together of body, mind, spirit with something larger than us. And a lot of people translate to mean union, but it means whole. And that's our true nature, is whole. You're already whole. You can't be anything else, according to yoga, right? And all the practices of yoga serve to remind us and to remember, just like you said, bring it back together to help you know your true nature. And like, I love, and all of that, like when I had a yoga teacher who talked about kriyas in the body. So the prana, the energy that just like moves the body without us knowing. And it reminded me so much of when I grew up in a charismatic Pentecostal church, right? So I'm familiar with all of this stuff, and the spirit would move people, right? And they're just like moving. And it's kriyas, it's that energy that just flows. And when you allow it, it helps to move and bring the healing where healing can be done, right? And there's some things that don't need to be healed. We can learn how to carry it, and all of those same principles serve to help us do that as well. Like, yes, everything you said, what I wanted to be doing was like, amen, amen. When you were saying, because it's so true, so
And
true.
y'all are bringing up so many important points. One that you brought up, Tanya, is trauma can be passed on. It can come generation. Sometimes it's not your personal trauma, but it's stored, and it's stored in the energetic body at conception and as you develop in utero. And I'll have patients all the time, and you know that there's a trauma there, a deep trauma, and they have no idea. And then what happens, especially in people of color, it's a trauma that's been generational. So it's in that energetic body. And when people learn that, yes, it's part of them and it is what makes them who they are, but that trauma can be healed. So I'm so happy that you brought up intergenerational trauma, which in yoga they will call karma. But we have the studies now. I've been in reproductive medicine now for 25 years, and we can actually see trauma stored on the sperm cells of the father. And so a traumatized father can pass that trauma down to their child and grandchild, but we also see it heal if they resolve the trauma. The sperm physically changes. So this is important. It's important that you two offer a way to actually process and heal trauma, grief, and sadness. And that's kind of a tangent too, so I don't know if anybody wants to speak to it or if we want to move to something else.
Well, I will say, just to speak a little bit to when I said that my daughter had a traumatic, and I could do this because it happened right at her C6 and C7 cervical spine. She had 2 years ago an autoimmune virus that attacked the cells of her C6, C7 cervical spine, and she was completely paralyzed down the left side and whole side of her face. And she was 5 years old at the time, and no doctors, CDC, no doctors, no one knew what this was, where it came from, totally random, all the things. But what was beautiful about the medical profession not knowing was that it allowed me to go into spirit and into healing on all different ways, that because doctors weren't saying take this drug or do this thing, and they did, she had a blood transfusion, there were lots of things that happened. But I remember my yoga teacher at the time, I called her in the middle of getting all these opinions in the hospital, and she said to me, it seems like your daughter, like her system is breaking down. But what I feel is that her charge is actually too big for her body, and that she's receiving a system upgrade. When she said the word system upgrade to me, and Mary Mitchell will love this, an entire play dropped into my spirit. And me and my husband have since created a piece of, it's basically a mixture of yoga and spoken word and theater and music, all about, so this part of the body here also, which is where your vagal nerve is deeply connected to ancestors and to the past and ancestral healing. And Noemi, who's my daughter, is 13 generations removed from slavery in the West. I mean, I'm 13 generations, she's the 14th generation. And this play is about what happens when your body decides to no longer be immune. And what if she was rebelling from the slave gene that had been passed down to her, and she's actually the first of the last of the slaves, and that her body has decided in her cells that she will not be immune anymore, and who gets to decide, right? And so to me, it's taking the trauma of that experience, using art, using yoga, using spirit, using healing to say that I get chills even to think like her body can decide to not pass this on anymore.
Mm.
And so to me, I'm interested in having these conversations as an artist, as a yogi, as a mother, as a Black woman, in all of these spheres, these conversations of what happens when our body decides and when we allow our body to what seemed like break down, but maybe she was strong enough to allow it to break down so that the cells could be regenerated in a way that's whole.
What?
And that's how we chose to see her trauma and empower our family and our lineage and who we are moving forward.
And that's the way wholeness happens. That's the way healing occurs. There's so many studies and research about that. And I'll tell you, look into some of the research behind cancer, because there's scientists who have done a lot of research and really believe that, cancer, a lot of times are cells that are speeding up so fast. There's this whole theory that our bodies are trying to speed up to cope with all of this new technology. And so that there will be generations of us who will sacrifice ourselves through cancer so that the next generation will actually be able to cope with and utilize all of the technology. It's really fascinating how our bodies adapt. And it's powerful what you just said. Yeah.
It sucks for me though.
Say that again?
I mean, if that's a theory. If that's what was happening with my son and he died of this brain tumor, that sucks for me. That's all I'm saying.
Right.
For me.
I think just to speak to that though, I think that this is what we needed. Every situation is different, but this was about
your story was so powerful.
Yeah. Just to say, and even as I was saying that, it's saying that just like every body is different, this is what her body, this is the message that her body was coming through her body or her ancestors or her path. I mean, my heart, obviously. But just to say that this is, every journey is every journey is so individual. And as I was even speaking, I was thinking to your work and to the chakras particularly, and to these places in the body, and to, I don't know if I could even ask you a question about how trauma is stored energetically in terms of the chakras, because for talking about the throat chakra and the vagal nerve in the back of the throat and working with this generational piece here.
Well, it's really interesting.
What is that connection for you?
Well, I think people really like to talk about each of the different chakras, and they each do sort of have their own job, right? Like I see them as sort of energetic organs that function and do certain jobs. Like everybody, not everybody knows, but like the root chakra is like sort of the primary energetic space where we're connected to our roots and ancestry. But also, like you're saying, it's not just that one thing, it's a full system. And they also work together integratively. And then it's interesting too, how sort of like the koshas, which are the yogic sort of layers of our being, the closer each of the chakras are to each other, the more they kind of impact each other. So the bottom three really interact a lot, and the top three do too. And the heart space is sort of the bridge between them, but it's all one thing. Like, Keith, like in integrative medicine and in the Chinese medicine, it's an entire system. And then the Western view likes to break things apart and say, well, individually, these things do this. And I think it's some of both of those pieces. Like our heart has a job that it does, but it's vital to the entire system, right? It's all one thing. And I think that each of the chakra spaces support each other. And the goal, again, is this wholeness of seeing how they all work together as a whole. And yeah, like I was being a little, not really flippant, I guess is not the word. I was just thinking when you were saying what you were saying, Keith, that when people have somebody they love who die of cancer, those sort of theories are just sort of like, well, it does, it sucks for me. Right. Like, I totally believe that my son had such a high purpose. I know that he did. I know that whatever he came to do, he did it and he was done. And I was, my job in that moment of his whole life was to help him on his path. And I know that, and I'm the one who was left here to continue mine. But it still sucks for me. So it's sort of that, and then allowing your feelings to be what they are and working with those emotions. And just to come back to the trauma piece, like Mary Mitchell and I were talking about trauma and particularly traumatic grief and what makes traumatic grief traumatic. And it's very similar to something you said too, Tanya, of, we clinically, we have ways of measuring trauma and specific things we look at, but experientially, when you've had trauma, you feel it. So it's an individual experience. But one of the things that I do with people is to help them understand like how it's showing up in their body, what it is their nervous system is doing. It's really trying to help us, and when we can understand the process of what's going on when we have those cues of trauma, to be able to know what's going on in the brain and in the nervous system and how it affects all the systems, then, the hormones and the circulatory system and all of it, it's all one, it's functioning together. When you understand it, it's so much easier to manage it because it's not as scary anymore. And then it allows us to be able to move through those moments of post-traumatic stress. When I don't like to use the word disorder because I don't think it's a disorder. It is a natural response to a messed up event, to a traumatic event, right? And we're having a normal, natural response to it. We're all here because our ancestors were scared all the time, right? Like we evolved to be able, it's an alarm system. And when we learn how it works, we can see our bodies and our emotions and our feelings as helpers and messages. And learning how to work with that and learning how to express it and help it move is so crucial to the transformation piece, Keith, that you were talking about. Like you can't push it. Like people want to move from, oh, I've had this grief, I've had this trauma. How do I transform this? Like help me transform it right now. That's not how it works. In the metaphor of the butterfly that a lot of people love to talk about, if you really know what happens to a butterfly or the caterpillar, they go in their chrysalis and they are literally broken down into goo. Like it's like a soup in there. And the mago cells, which mean mother, right, come back together to create an entirely new creature. That's got to be really scary and painful when that goes on. And if you're in the middle of it, how do you even know where the end is? We can't. So it's like when you're in the gooey soup, allowing it to be, and it's so hard because it takes courage for one thing, and faith, like whatever that means to each person. And like you were saying, Mary Mitchell, so many people feel like they're losing hope and losing faith, and I understand that. It is, when you're in the dark night of the soul, it's painful because it feels like you're never going to get out of there. You're never going to get out. And the mystics all say that's the place you want to be because that then is the reemergence is glorious. But when you're in it, you're like, this ain't never going to be over. It's scary.
And I think that's the heart. Go ahead, Mary Mitchell.
Well, no, I was just going to say it's a funny thing because even just hearing the two of you brilliant women speak about trauma and yoga and all the things that you have like overcome and worked through and processed, it's really making me even just realize today like how much I've not acknowledged within myself, that I'm still, because I feel like those of us, there are so many different coping mechanisms, and one of my coping mechanisms is to be busy, and to try to in many ways push through. And I feel like a lot of what you're saying is like allowing yourself with that compassion and lack of judgment to really not push through in a certain way. Is that right?
I think I definitely agree. And I think what comes up for me is a lot of the work that I do is around the social body as well, and how, yes, we are, yes, we're talking about individual bodies and the trauma that's trapped in our bodies and grief in our bodies, but there's also a collective grief, a collective trauma, and also, let's not forget, systemic trauma that that you can do and this is why a lot of my work is about dismantling white supremacy in yoga and in spiritual spaces, because many a times I've come and I've done the work, I've gone into the hole, I've done this, and I still feel like something's stepping on my neck, and I still can't get free, and I'm doing all the things, and that's because we're not acknowledging this social system and this social body and the other ways that trauma can enforce itself on the body, without us just being individual bodies in space. And how is our collective body being traumatized, oppressed, brought down? And so I always want to actually speak to that as well, because I know that I've heard, many of people, I've done many of, just done all of these things, and sometimes been this body in the space being like, okay, and there's something else there that no one is acknowledging or speaking to. And so it's like also talking on a grander scale of how do we lift these social traumas, or these social systems that are keeping people from getting free, so that it isn't just our own individual inability to acknowledge, or our own individual. This busyness is also tied to capitalism. This busyness is like what like what are the other what are the external systems that also are keeping us down and keeping us in these places of collapse? And it isn't just our own individual work to undo it. Of course we have to do that, and each individual body will create a collective, but we also have to, we get out of the guilt and shame that is associated with it when we think that my body alone can take care of all the things that are telling me also that I have to make this much money, because then I can't eat, because then I can't. There's so much that's tied in, all the isms that keep us trapped in these places. So again, just acknowledging that for you, hearing you speak, I'm like, yes, the busyness, and that's given to you. Yeah. Like, just to speak to that as well, so that those who are listening also know, like, it feels like a lot because it is a lot, and because there are systems in place to keep you collapsed. Yeah. And to speak to those systems, and to that we have to get free individually, but we also have to wake up to see the systems that are around us that are also keeping us in this traumatic collapse.
Yeah, and we touched on this right before you signed on, Tanya. We were talking about the grief of the Black culture and Black people. And I was saying, there's also, it exists in a different way in the white culture and community, and this denial of any culpability, and how it has to start being talked about. And it's very uncomfortable for most white people to have those conversations, because they want to deny and say, well, that wasn't me, I didn't do that, and I'm not racist, because this idea that if racism equals you're a bad person, not looking at, we're all born into the same water, that we're all swimming in it, and it's been around. Like, white supremacy is connected to white nationalists and Nazis. It is a literal, our entire culture is set up so that the white person is supreme, and the white experience, and we're sort of seen as, we're the neutral ones, and everybody else has race. And it's not true. And we have to start looking at it, white people need to start talking about that stuff, or else it's never going to be healed, and we can't move forward as a nation, as a people, until that stuff starts getting acknowledged and pulled out and looked at and examined in all of its ugliness. It just has to. So yeah, that's a huge grief that goes back, oh my God, hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's painful. And I think we all feel it in different ways. And particularly white people don't have any words. Nobody knows how to talk about it, because it means, oh, I must be bad if I acknowledge this. And like you said, it feels huge because it is.
Yeah, and I think what's important too is that so much of my work right now is to create the spaces for Black bodies to do the healing work actually lovingly apart from white bodies, because to watch white bodies reckon with this for the first time for a lot of them, it is inherently traumatic for us.
Yeah, certainly.
to watch and to experience. And so how are we creating spaces where we can find the healing and the grief work and the work that, and not to say, it's the same thing with yoga, right? How we can't spiritual bypass to think it's all oneness all the time. It's like we
Right.
have to hold the polarity, and maybe we do have to come apart to understand our systems to come back together whole. And I think that it really is a time for that. And so instead of, I don't even think of it as like segregating bodies, or I think of, we have our healing spaces and our spaces where we might have to deal with grief in a different context right now. And there will be a time, because there is no yoga, like you said, until we yoke, until we fully can come back together. So the ultimate goal is to come back together in wholeness. But what is the work that we're called to do right now in our individual communities, cultures, and spaces around something as big as grief?
Oh yeah.
Wow. That
Like
was very,
Mary Mitchell's eyes.
I'm like, wow, mind blown. So many amazing things.
It's a
I'm
lot. I
curious-
mean,
yeah,
it's a lot.
it's deep. It's very deep. I wish we could actually talk for like 3 hours, but
I know.
I do have one practical question, which is just thinking about the fact that a lot of the people who do tune into this are artists and are facing a lot of anxiety and a lot of unease about the future and about sort of like, it feels very powerless at the moment to just sort of not know, and to be out of work on things that we've trained for our entire lives and etc. Tanya knows quite well. And so I'm curious to hear from you guys about the ways you think we can use yoga to help us in this process.
Karla, please take it away.
Go ahead. What'd you say, Tanya?
No, I said take it away.
Well, I'll say the movement piece is really, and my training is in integral yoga, and in that particular school of yoga, we don't really focus hugely on a lot of structural pieces. You don't have to have a perfect pose. And in fact, especially in beginners, it's discouraged to sort of tell people they're doing something wrong. And also I've not been, I can't say I'm a performer really. I mean, I have performed, but I've danced my whole life. And so that more organic movement feels really natural to me. And in fact, like moving sadness and griefy feelings is really helpful with more sort of like flowy movements and organic movements. And so that's one thing. And I consider that to be yoga. It's more of a tantric practice, really, and that sort of energetic, allowing the energy to move your body in whatever ways feels natural and organic to you. You may or may not have music on, it doesn't matter. But just like following the movements of your energy inside your body and just having a space so you can just like allow it to flow in whatever way feels like good to you. Do that, a lot of that, and if you start crying, then just move with the tears, allow it to flow just like a river. So like that kind of movement, I really recommend. And a lot of people feel really shy about it, but just like nobody needs to be watching you. A lot of the people watching this show may not feel that way, but a lot of my clients do. They get real weird about it. And then I do all sorts of weird stuff and they'll maybe barely move, but big like movements, like really start to move the energy, can be incredibly helpful. Also meditation, and it's very simple, but also can feel really difficult because what it asks us to do is to get still. And then when we get still, all sorts of stuff starts rising up. We don't have time to teach meditative techniques right now, but you can find that stuff all over the place. It's not hard. There's really only two kinds of meditation. There's the kind where you put your attention on one thing and keep it there. Oh yeah, there's but
you can find it there.
Find it there. And also there's actually on my website, I have a very simple meditation and some recorded other things that you can listen to if you want. But there's that resource is all over the place. There's the kind where you put your attention on a thing and keep it there. And every time your thoughts wander, you come back to it. And there's the kind where you put your attention on nothing. And that might be sometimes a little harder to do. That's my preferred way. But anyway, it really helps you to learn how to regulate your nervous system. It helps you to learn how to be with what is. And it helps you and technically in your brain, like your brain is not a muscle, but like a muscle, the more you use specific parts of the brain the denser they become. And the part of our brain that is, and it doesn't matter whether you think you're good at meditation or not, the practice itself helps to strengthen the areas of our brain that help us to deal with stress and anxiety, the parts of our brain that help us feel connected to other people, and the parts of our brain that help us feel connected to something larger. So those parts of our brain get stimulated in a meditation practice. And then just like if you go to the gym and you lift a bunch of weights, you don't have to, if I need you to come help me move something heavy, you don't have to stop and first go lift a bunch of weights to get your muscles up. The strength is there. So the strength of your brain to help you manage stressful moments and moments of anxiety and fear and traumatic stress that may come up from cues in your environment or in your mind or wherever they come from, you have more strength and ability to do it. And then the third thing I think is really crucial is breathing. Learning how to breathe, because grief, and Keith will attest to this, and I learned this when I was writing the Yoga for Grief and Loss book, that because I didn't know a lot about Chinese medicine, and I learned that all of the organs of the body have a corresponding emotion, and the emotion of the lungs is grief. Like the lungs are helping us deal with grief all the time, like little griefs even, like if, and this is not to any way take away from major grief, but if I lose my favorite pen, I might like grieve that for a little bit, be like, God damn, I wish I could find that pen. I really like this pen. Tiny little griefs, right? Like our lungs deal with that all day long. But then you have the big ones that come and it's overwhelming to the energetic system. And then that energetic system also is right next to the physical body. And so your lungs, I remember moments where I would just like suddenly realize I literally was not breathing and have to gasp for air, just like my lungs weren't working. And so
that gasping for air is it's an actual inspiration.
Well, yeah, because it was so shocking to me. I didn't know I wasn't breathing, right? It's like being underwater and then suddenly your lungs are screaming for air. I didn't even know I wasn't breathing.
But so it's a physical inspiration and it's a spiritual and it's an emotional inspiration. Yes. It actually,
yes.
And if, sorry, go ahead.
No, well, I was going to say is to keep it simple for people who don't understand yoga, because there are people here who have no clue what yoga is and they can look into it because it's beneficial. But just remember, in times like this, when we feel like we have no control, we always have control over our breath.
Yep.
And emotionally in our brain, if we do one thing that we can control, it expands out in your life and it makes you feel like you have more control over all of your life. So right now, this not knowing what's going to happen in the future, this grief, I think breathing exercises are extremely important, again, for the inspiration, the movement of energy, and to mind hack yourself that, wait a minute, I have control over at least how I breathe in my life. And it can change other aspects.
And it works. Like Keith, everybody has anxiety. It's human. I had never had a quote panic attack until after my son died. And I had these crazy, and they still hit me sometimes, but I'm telling you right now, I can stop when I feel it coming, like your heart starts racing. If you let it go, like your throat will start closing up and people get scared. People literally go to the hospital thinking they're having a heart attack and a panic attack. But I can stop and I can start to breathe deep in my belly and just start, and I don't even care what the trigger is. I don't care. Like it doesn't matter to me where it comes from. I can stop a panic attack in under 30 seconds. And so can you if you learn how to breathe properly. And because people will like poo-poo and be like, oh, deep breathing. No, for real, it works. Because when your sympathetic nervous system is running, which is your fight flight mode, which is when you're panicking, when you're anxious, when all that's happening, that is where breath is typically shallow and in your upper chest like this. And I can cue an attack just by breathing that way. When we are calm and the parasympathetic nervous system is running, your rest and relax and digest mode, our breathing is lower and it's centered in our belly at our abdomen. And like you said, your breath is the one autonomic function you can also control. And when you can shift that, it can calm that nervous system down.
I just want to make sure that I'm always adding to the social aspect of breathing. But what we're in right now is a triple pandemic of climate crisis, of the Earth's body, the individual body of COVID, and the social body of racism.
Yes.
Right.
Mhm.
And so these three, and all three are saying, I can't breathe.
Yeah.
All three are saying, I can't breathe.
Unbelievable.
And so to give the agency to bodies to say, when you unapologetically take up space with your breath, just by breathing, it's more, yes, it's all of these things. And you are making a political public outcry by breathing.
Amen.
Like just by taking up space with your breath, when you're breathing, you're doing it for more than just yourself. You're doing it for the earth. You're doing it for, so always wrapping in, like, if you can't do it for you, choose one. Like you can do it for so many, you can do it.
And you just summed it up. And I hope people, and I'm not being condescending, but I know that there are people who are going, huh, what? Just go back and listen to that again. Go back and listen to what Tanya just said, because that's it.
On repeat.
Put it on repeat.
No, really. We are running long, so I'm going to jump to our lightning round because
I have a patient coming in 5 minutes.
I'll have to go.
Yeah.
You guys, this has been one of the most
gotta go.
truly amazing things. Okay. All right. I'm going to go Karla, Tanya. So ready? Karla, what is your favorite thing to do for self-care?
Breathe.
Tanya.
Yoga.
Karla, what do you love to do first thing in the morning?
Breathe.
Tanya.
Stretch.
Read a 2-minute meditation on my phone.
Mm-hmm. Karla, what's your favorite food?
Oh my God. Corn on the cob.
Tanya.
Oh, right now it's deep fried mushrooms.
Karla, beach or mountains?
Beach.
Tanya.
Beach.
Ooh. Karla, where do you think of as home?
Mountains.
Tanya.
Canada.
Oh. Karla, how do you deal with being angry?
Stomp and then breathe.
I like the breathing. Tanya.
I'm doing better.
What sound do you love?
My child's laughter.
Oh, a deep moan, a deep sigh.
If you were a spice, what spice would you be? This is the last question.
Ooh, I think cinnamon.
I was going to say cinnamon, but to be I'm going to say turmeric, but cinnamon, yes.
They go together nicely.
You are both amazing. I thank you for this particularly profound version of what I'm going to call Wholeness Wednesday.
Wholeness Wednesday.
I was listening.
Can I add something very quick before we leave, which is if you follow me on @SoHumanity, I'm going to be leading a 4-day video and virtual retreat on the We Can Breathe, on breathing from earth, individual, and social body. So if you're interested on that, and with continued content and work, and particularly for bodies of color with allies. So anyone who's wants to do this dismantling work within the bodies and within systems, check it out. Check it out.
And I'll say too, I've got several courses that are going to get started mid-August. Basic meditation, yoga for grief, and also one on the chakras. So yeah, it's Karla Helbert on Instagram, and you can just visit my website too, which is just karlahelbert.com. So this has been awesome.
And powerful, and I'm going to review this a few times.
Thank you so much, Karla, Tanya,
thank you,
Mary Mitchell,
thank you,
Artists Striving to End Poverty. We're going to be back next week with Wholeness Wednesday with Asmaret Geber McKell.
Yay, Asmaret!
Asmaret Geber McKell will be here next week. Thanks for joining us. Love to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.